Hi, it's Raghu, and I'm back with the original mind roller, David Silver. And we're just joking around a little bit. That's why I just broke into this with a.
Well, we're always
it's good
joking
to break
around
into
a
it
bit.
with a smile. Yes, it's good.
It is.
Hi, Dave.
In these times. Hi, Raghu. Hi.
It's great to see you again. This is another edition of our Just Ask the Experts. And we're going to talk about shit we don't know anything about. But we've made some cursory effort. And I have to say, Dave, since he taught in university and so on and so forth, is a very studious person. And he, in a very short period of time, he can grasp a topic. In this case, it's George Gurdjieff. Okay, he was a philosopher back in the day, not that far back in the day, but he was very much part of what happened with us in the late 60s, early 70s, hippies, and we were finding out about all kinds of different methodologies to go alongside of the psychedelics that we were taking, so to say. And also, once we met Ram Dass, he talked a lot about Gurdjieff, because Gurdjieff had some very unique ideas. And there's other aspects of him that I do believe are going to be pretty interesting. As Dave recounted to me the other day when we were going, okay, we're going to talk about Gurdjieff. Well, what's he like? Because how big was the book you read, by the way?
Well, I just read Meetings with Remarkable Men. And the most remarkable thing about that is that I read it because it's endless. And my opinion of his writing skills is fairly low. He wrote in a very turgid manner. And,
turgid. Oof.
Yes. And to
it sounds like what it is. Almost.
Well, yeah. I mean, he is a master of what our president calls the weave. He just rambles way out every single time. It's not just once. And it's kind of hard to read. And I've never, a mutual friend of ours, who I won't mention, said that he got 20 pages into it, and that was it for him forever. That wasn't the case with me, and for the simple reason that I was 16 and living at home, going to school in England, and my father, Jack, whose reading was basically about English football stars.
Really?
And sport, yeah. He was into reading about sport, cricket and football being the only sports he cared about. And, reading the occasional detective novel or something. He wasn't an avid reader, although he was a very smart man. And I'm going to tell the story as it happened. I came home from school one day, and I was in that stage of adolescence when I just couldn't wait to get out of school. And I got home, and I was ready to do whatever I was going to do that night, probably go to a club that I went to called Mermaid, which I was underage and lied about. And before I could do that, my dad said to me, "David, I want to talk to you." And I thought, oh, God. What have I done, And I went into his study, and he said, "Sit down." And on his desk, or a table, I think it was, there were 3 huge books. And he said, "These books I've acquired for a reason. I'm 60 years old, and I don't know how much longer I have on this planet. So I'm banishing the sports books. And I'm only now going to read Gurdjieff, Ouspensky, Araj, and Bennett." And I said, okay. I didn't know, it sounded like a Russian rock band to me. But anyway, I said, well, what is that? He said, well, look at the books. They're huge. And he'd got them from the library, the local library. And I just couldn't work it out why he was reading these books all of a sudden. I mean, he was no dummy. Very smart man, but he was basically a businessman and wasn't particularly into philosophy. But he was a very spiritual person in his own way. And he said, look, this book by a guy called Ouspensky, called In Search of the Miraculous, and this book by the guy called George Gurdjieff, called Meetings with Remarkable Men, are books that I'm reading, and I've been reading them for a few months, but I've been sort of keeping them secret, not sacred, but secret, because your mum probably thinks I've gone crazy. And so he told me what Gurdjieff was about, and I listened, and then I got out of there as quick as I possibly could, because I wasn't really that interested. You know, when you're 16, you're not thinking about death and life and mortality and all of that. I wasn't. Basically thinking about girls. And but my dad was very persuasive, and I began to read Uspensky and then Gurdjieff. And then I went to university and I forgot all about them. And then I went to America and I forgot all about university. And as Raghu so accurately said, before very long, those people that one came into contact with then, if you wanted to, were talking about Gurdjieff, including Ramdas, but I didn't know that yet. This was the 60s. And in 1967, 68, when I started to expand my consciousness, I had a vision of my father and remembered his words about Gurdjieff. And it suddenly struck me, and if I'm being long-winded, I'm sorry, but there's no other way of doing this. I realized that he resembled Gurdjieff. My father was absolutely bald from the age of 30. And when I finally saw a picture of George Gurdjieff, he reminded me of my father. My father had very, very piercing eyes and a bald head, and was very certain in his ways, and was not a dabbler in anything. He really had clear vision. And I thought about it. I guess it wasn't an acid trip, but it was around that time when we were all doing it, so it was probably still in me. And I thought, I got to read Gurdjieff again. So in deference to my dad, really, who I loved a lot, I did reread, I think it was All and Everything, which is an impossible book to read. And I just can't recommend anyone reading these books. Because not really. I mean, you can if you want, but you've got to give yourself a lot of time. It'll take weeks and a lot of concentration and focus and a lot of tearing of the hair, because he's a difficult writer. However, as Raghu said, he had an influence on the 60s and the kinds of things that were emerging in the 60s and then in the 70s. He was connected with that in a way that was almost visceral because of his ideas and because of his vintage. Because everyone else was contemporary, you know, Tim Leary and so on, Alan Watts, all those guys were around. But Gurdjieff really lived, I think he was born about 1868 or no one knows when he was born, by the way. And I believe he died in 1949. So he was at his height in the late part of the 19th century and in the first 25 years of the 20th century. He came from an unusual family. I always thought he was Russian, but he wasn't Russian at all. There was such a thing as the Russian Empire at that time, which resembled the later Soviet Union. It was headed by the Tsar. And Armenia was part of the Russian Empire. His mother was Armenian, his father was Greek. And his father, Ivan Ivanovich Gurdjieff, was a shepherd, a cowherd, and I must look at a piece of paper now to get it right. He was what they call in Armenia an ashok, Ashokh, Ashokh. And he used the name Adash, not his real name, which was Ivan Ivanovich Gurdjieff. And an ashok is a bard, a poet, a singer, a storyteller, a mystic. So it's interesting to me that, and he gave his son, George Gurdjieff, the one we know, strict instructions as to how to live his life with awareness, clarity, and honesty. And you know, that really resonated with me because my father did the same thing to me. I didn't become a Gurdjieff, but I certainly became a person that was totally involved for the rest of my life in transcendental transformation, and also, and this is where Gurdjieff really comes in how to live a life. His father basically said to him, you must not do anything old, You must always try and do something new and fresh. You must always be honest. I mean, you must always support yourself. These are all important in Gurdjieff's life. And you must be in search of the miraculous, because what else is there? And because his father was a bard and sang mystical songs and poems, Gurdjieff was brought up in that atmosphere. And he went on to form a following. He created a following by the time he was, I think, by the early part of the 20th century, and traveled all over Europe and Asia and Transcaspia and Transcaucasia and Greece and everywhere. And he walked a lot of the time from place to place. They say, well, there's no camels available to go to, Arabia, as it was called then. And he said, well, can I get a carriage? No. So he would be in, 1,500 miles from there. And he'd say, okay, I'll walk.
And he did?
And he would walk for 4 months to a place.
Wow.
Now, on the way, he had multiple adventures, meetings with remarkable men and women. And he was more about the intrepid nature of living a life where you are independent of all cant religion, even though he was a devout Christian, actually. He was an Orthodox Christian. But he didn't like the, shall we say, the trappings of religion. And he was like many of our current, or people that Raghu and you people watching, listening know about, our gurus and masters and guides who are not about being Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or anything. It's all good. It's all good. And that was Gurdjieff's absolute mantra, which was, it doesn't matter. And his following was full of all kinds of people, princes, counts, homeless people, crazy mystics, everybody who met him, and got the point, followed him. So he created something that is now known, and was then too, as the work. The work. And that's interesting too, because it isn't just the work of becoming conscious or aware or devout. It was both things. It was work towards having clear mentation, and that was the word he used, mentation. Mentation is not just thoughts. It's how to live your life, and through one's thinking, through one's vision, and through one's teachers. But the work also meant work. And that's what he kind of became famous for, was what you did if you joined his institute. But more interesting than that, to me, because that was a class, like we've all been to a class with the master, and the person has talked to us and enlightened us if possible sometimes. What his work was about was not only working on yourself, but actually working. So he worked his whole life. He never had, it seems to me, more than 3 months ahead of money, rubles, usually. He was broke most of the time. And he never relied upon anything except his own bizarre width as a person. I mean, in terms of what he would do to make money, so that then he could help people for free. And so, typically, he would be in a town like Tiflis and a lot of other towns that I can't pronounce, in Armenia and in Russia and in Turkey, and later in Middle Eastern countries, and then in France and in the United States. He lectured in New York in 1924. But before he got to that point in his life, he was broke all the time. And as he wanted to kind of support his teachings, he didn't want to be beholden to anyone. So he would go from town to town and reinvent himself in every town to do something else. I'll give you a good example here. I have to read this because it's slightly complex. One town he went to, it could have been Tiflis, but it doesn't really matter. He had like 10 kopecks in his pocket, which is like a dime. And it wasn't worth anything then. It wasn't like the inflation so bad. No, it was worth nothing. He had no money. And he decided he had to do something, and he went to a town, and he made a big sign that said, "American Traveling Workshop, here for a very short time makes and repairs everything. And he did that. He did that. Absolutely. And some of the things he mended were sewing machines, typewriters, early electrical devices, bicycles, anything. But to give an example of his crazy, intrepid behavior, he'd think of ways to make money where other people wouldn't. And he was obsessed with money. Let's not avoid that. He wanted money all the time so he could teach people for free and have them grow. But he grew by the very challenge of always working towards something. In this American traveling workshop, which of course wasn't American, and it wasn't traveling, it was a workshop. He never went anywhere else with this. It was just in one town where he had to make money to get camels to go over some desert to reach some 250-year-old crone who was going to teach him about God. So when he was doing this, he was repairing, sewing machines and so forth, and it didn't make that much money. And then some person told him they'd been in Paris and had learned there'd been a big fashion change. And that the long corsets the women wore in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, had completely gone out of fashion, and now the fashion was short corsets. Okay? What is Dave talking about here? Well, he thought about this a while. He thought, the ones they're selling in this little town in Armenia are long corsets. These people don't know the Paris fashions. So he bought every corset in that town. There was 260 of them. And then he had a woman friend of his cut them and then re-sew them as new, as short corsets. And he made a fortune. A fortune. And then he had the ability to take 20 people into some other weird place and learn something about something.
Hey,
I'm sorry.
I just want to, because this got to continue because it's all really fascinating stuff. But I found something that at least gives people, because like me, I, of course, did not read much of any of that, and I forgot about it, and all I remembered was key things about kind of what he represented. One of them was only 0.2% of the entire population on Earth can become conscious. He said something like that, right?
Very much like that.
Yeah. So, but there were things that just jived right in with where we were at the time, and still. So Gurdjieff's philosophy is centered around the idea that humans are incomplete. Nature brings us only to a certain point and then leaves us to develop further by our own means. While we remain undeveloped, we live in a state of sleep, remotely connected to our immediate environment and ignorant of our restricted condition. Gurdjieff frequently used the term mechanical to describe our functioning. Like machines, we are stimulus response, lacking a true conscious government that directs our actions. We hire a multitude of conflicting impulses and are only unified by name and appearance. To awaken from sleep would first mean to become aware of our true condition, to stop pretending to ourselves and others that we are unified. This gradual awakening is accomplished through disciplined self-observation, inner struggle, and conscious effort. Once awakened, the individual can then die to their false pretenses and give birth to a real and unified self. This would mark the fulfillment of our human potential. I think that kind of really says whatever I took away from this, understanding of how, especially how we absolutely we're at the mercy of everything that's coming at us and we are reacting to. And that's creating this persona that we relate to as the I when we think, and so on. So he had that perspective, which really fit into Ram Dass's perspective,
For sure, yes. Ram Dass was just a lot more cheerful about it. Because George Gurdjieff was not an easy dude. He had what he called enemies. He didn't have an enemies list, but there were people he didn't like and wouldn't talk to. And the walking sleep was his description of most of the population, as you said. And what actually, what is the essence of it? And I did a little research and found out that what the essence of the work was to actually achieve that state of clarity and independence. It's not a herding thing, because the herd, the mob, politics were anathema to him. In fact, he described most political activity as psychosis. He called it political psychosis. And he said that every so often, this is so interesting for our times, he knew every so often masses of people go crazy because of one charismatic person. And in his day, it was, a whole different thing. And he was the thing he hated most of all was war. And actually, when the Russian Revolution happened, as many of you know, World War II was simultaneous with that. So what was going on in Eastern Europe was not only a war with the Kaiser's Germany, but also a brewing revolution which erupted in 1917. And Gurdjieff would do anything to get away from any of this. Anything. He felt that it was such folly and such craziness and so anti-human and also anti-Christian that he would do anything to get away from it and had no faith in it. And when the revolution happened, he says in one of his books, he said, it was so terrible that when you woke up in the morning, you didn't know who was actually in the streets, which side was in the streets. Sometimes
he lived through that in Russia?
He wasn't in Russia. This was in some other part of the Russian Empire.
Oh.
He very rarely went to, he didn't like Russia. He went to Moscow a couple of times, but he wasn't really that into, I was wrong. I thought he was, but he was much more interested in the parts of the Russian Empire that sort of were linked with much more mystical and spiritual traditions. And so, he avoided, he said, I'd wake up and I'd know who was going to be out there, so I didn't care. I wasn't on one side or the other. In other words, he wasn't really a revolutionary in any political way. And so if it was the Mensheviks, I'd be nice to them. If it was the Bolsheviks, I'd be nice to them. Just leave me alone. And so, one has to think that instead of, it was such a rah-rah time, that war, such an absurd and awful war. And many, people in Germany and in the United Kingdom and everywhere were just taken by it. And when you see the footage and photographs of that war, it was just a horrendous thing. And he knew that, and he wanted nothing to do with it. He wasn't hoping one side would win or the other. He didn't give a damn. And also, the revolution meant nothing to him. He wasn't a fan of the Tsar and that regime, but he wanted peace and, shall we say, beauty, what he considered beauty between people. And war was the antipathy of that, and he never budged an inch in his whole life about it. I have a quote somewhere, but what I'd like to do, Raghu, I described him myself. I read a lot of descriptions, but I described him as an adventurer, a venturer, a seeker, and to some extent a finder. And the reason I say to some extent is that if you read the books, Meetings with Remarkable Men, and this one, which I can never remember the title, is called Life is Real Only Then When I Am. In other words, one's perception, and with quantum physics and what we know now and what's almost, sort of popular, is that we have our own universes, we have our own projections, we have our own movie playing. And what he was saying was that that's all very well, but if it's tied into other people's ideas and propaganda and viciousness and selfishness and materialism, even though he was a materialist in a funny kind of way, as I said, it was waste time. Don't bother. Go get laid. Go get drunk. Do it. I don't care. If you can't absorb this, you might as well live that life. But, when it came to what they actually taught at the Institute in Paris, when eventually he wasn't crazy about living anywhere else but Paris, and eventually ended up there. That's where the Institute was. And the basis of the whole damn thing, the solution to the sleep was the work, which is also called the fourth way. And the fourth way was self-study, self-observation, inner struggle, sacred movements, symbolic writings, and community. So when he says self-study and self-observation, that's no different from our teachers and friends sometimes. And, it was the same thing, which is you must know yourself. There must be self-awareness. You've got to start from there. And you've got to look at what you're doing, what you're accusing other people of doing, and seeing in yourself a shadow that Jung talked about, at the same time, back in the 1920s. He was very knowledgeable, Gurdjieff was very knowledgeable about the potential destructive power of the ego. And he talked about this all the time. So he challenged himself all the time. He said, if there's one thing I will always reject are those people that make me feel comfortable. That's a direct quote.
Really?
I like that one. He would never stay around anywhere. He had the sad experience of his mother and his wife. His mother died in a pretty awful state, and his wife died of cancer when she was young. And so he was alone, and in his travels, he would be lonely, but he would never sort of seek a comfort zone. And actually, Pema Chodron has said this many times, that if all you're doing is staying in your...
Excuse me.
Pema Chodron, blesses you. She says the comfort zone is the most dangerous room in the house. Because if that's all you do, is you can't go. You can go to it and relax, but if that's all you do, you're going to have another 50 million incarnations. So he was saying that all the time. That was what he did. So the reason he traveled all the time was because he loved the situation of being in a place where nobody knew him. He had no money. He had to do something to make money in order to teach eventually. And so he was on a camel much of the time. He was on a horse much of the time. Unfortunately, when the 20th century refined the early horseless carriages into automobiles, he drove and he had multiple crashes. He obviously wasn't a good driver.
Really?
He crashed and ruined his body. I mean, half of Gurdjieff's work is about his ill health. I mean, that's why reading it is quite
brutal.
Well, no, I'd say it's brutal, right? He just all talked about it because he said, well, I feel terrible. I can't sleep. I have pain all over my body. I think I have a disease. I may be able all these things. And he would just overcome them with usually a form of meditation and of herbal treatments and various wise men and women to be around. But he always got back to being ill. And part of it was that he would travel in this ridiculous manner into places where there were no doctors. And if you did get ill, you were screwed. And it was kind of his trip, He wasn't a masochist, but he believed that in order to challenge the nightmare of thoughts that were passing through his busy brain all the time, that you had to reach a new dimension by going to a new destination. Now, we can look at that and say that's nonsense. You can just sit there and meditate. But in 1895, the zeitgeist was not all about, reading books about the soul or going to retreats or going to meditations or kirtans. There was none of that. And so he literally made it out of whole cloth. He made a philosophy out of cloth. And his respect for Tibet, for instance, was profound because he met Tibetans in other parts of Transcaspia, as they call it, and was totally impressed by their ability to control their lives just simply by the discipline of meditation and chanting and medicine.
And pranayama, by the way. Being able to do tumo, keep warm in cold climates, all of that.
All that
tremendous discipline.
Yes. So his life really was his work. No matter what quote you look at any of them, I've got tons of them, he said, the aim was conscious being. This involves the spiritual transformation of the self and esoteric alchemy to create higher being bodies that can endure and serve both cosmic and personal purposes. And from that, he extrapolated that God is within all of us, except it's a different scale. we are God, but only God is God. Our God is what is inner. The other God we look at is looking at the whole thing inner and outer, and is inner and outer. He felt that his God, his sense of divine within himself, he insisted on saying it's a matter of scale. I am not God. I am God unto my inner being. And when you think about it, Raghu, I mean, other people were, I don't know what they were doing in 1895 or in 1910 or anything, but most of them were not talking about this. So he was really, really an adventurer of the spirit. And I understand now, I didn't think about it ever before, why Ramdas and others were, shall we, not so much guided by him, but understood that there was a path to take, and that he'd take it in the most adverse circumstances usually. And, you know, that's why the line between, shall we say, Vivekananda and Yogananda and the rest of the of that lineage and other great masters, he was there without even knowing about them until he did know something about them, just from personal experience, not from reading about them or seeing them. So what am I saying here? I think when we talked about it, Raghu, a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned that he was a front runner. He was like a showrunner for a great television series. He knew what the beginning, middle, and end was, even though he was an extremely discontented person much of the time. In other words, he was grouchy. He was nasty sometimes. He couldn't suffer fools in any way whatsoever. And yet at the same time, he didn't have an overarching ego, because, for instance, when he gave the talks in New York in 1924, he had other people read his work, and he would just sit there like a student. Sometimes he would write, and I'll finish this ramble in a minute, sometimes he would write 15, 20,000, 50,000 words, as much as that, and then burn or throw away and tear up the whole damn thing, and then start again. He did that a lot because he couldn't stand a kind of calcified teaching. The only teaching that was useful to him was what was happening in his heart and in his consciousness.
In the moment.
In that moment. Yeah. The writing that he did a year ago, and I identify with this rather a lot, that, Michael Philip Jagger said, actually to me once, Mick Jagger said, I will never write a book about myself because I'm not into the past. I don't want to relive it. I don't want to talk about it. I just want to be here now. I didn't use that expression, but that's what he meant. And coming from him, that was sort of interesting because he's had an interesting life. But Gurdjieff would rewrite and rewrite and rewrite based upon immediate awarenesses that sort of were further down the road. They were just further down the road than he'd been when he'd written something 6 weeks before. He learned by intensive self-awareness and self-examination something else. Something else about reincarnation, about medicine, about love, about anger, et cetera, et cetera.
Hey, did you heard? I mean, one thing I stumbled upon myself: the Sarmung Brotherhood.
Yeah, he came across them in Egypt, I think.
Yeah, the Seekers of Truth stumbled upon a brotherhood founded in Babylon, 2500 BC, called Sarmung. The Brotherhood repeatedly continued its activities in Mesopotamia, uninterruptedly up to the 7th century A.D. It was thought to have in its possession the keys to many secret mysteries. At a further point in their search, the seekers discover promising evidence that the Sarmung might still be in existence. They determined to find it. So here it says, Gurdjieff doesn't find the Sarmung.
No.
The Sarmung found him.
Yeah.
A representative of the order arrives in Bukhara with apparent foreknowledge of Gurdjieff, as if the Sarmung had been monitoring his search, blindfolded and under an oath of secrecy. Gurdjieff and another member of the Seekers of Truth are taken on a few days' journey and admitted to its chief monastery. There, they are surprised to meet a third member of their group, brought by the Sarmanga independently. And Gurdjieff said, the sheikh of the monastery. So this happened. I mean, this is like, what?
Yeah.
This is so
Yeah.
incredible. The sheikh of the monastery appointed as our guide, one of the oldest monks. After this, we entered into the life of the monastery, were allowed access almost everywhere, and began gradually to find out about everything. He spent 3 months there. He gradually he was admitted from its outer to its innermost courtyards and becomes exposed to its mysteries. In its innermost courtyard, he witnesses sacred dances of a remarkable level. He is shown some very old devices designed to help train dancers to perform these dances. What very old devices?
They were things that the women, they were all women, would use, hang on to for shapes, for making shapes, and within the dance, you know. So his sacred dances later, you know, De Hartmann and other great people would write music for them, and I have a lot of that music myself, and it's very quiet piano music.
Yeah, I've heard it myself before.
It's
I mean, also
wonderful.
Uspensky was involved big time.
Yes.
Anyhow, he goes on to say, he does not mention, he didn't say he was initiated during this visit to the monastery. Initiations, nor to any other monastery for that matter. Instead, Gurdjieff's initiations happen alone, usually in moments of great inner turbulence, on the verge of despair, when forced to make a special effort to reconcile contradictions in himself. He never bumped into psychedelics, though, right?
No, he didn't. He didn't.
That's interesting, too.
He drank a lot, and he would drink to find joy. You know, sometimes it would get him in a lot of trouble because he'd be in some bar or in some weird place in the Russian Empire, and there'd be drunken sailors in there, and he'd get in a fight and get a black eye and fall on the ground. He was really like that. But, you know, I'm reminded, and I've mentioned this to you before, from what you just said, he would be in that monastery and it would come to him. And I just have to do this because I love this so much. It reminds me of this Rumi quote. And this is the quote: "When I run after what I think I want, my days are a furnace of stress and anxiety. If I sit in my own place of patience, what I need flows to me and without pain. From this I understand that what I want also wants me, is looking for me and attracting me. There is a great secret here for anyone who can grasp it." And that's pure Gurdjieff.
That's so great.
Now, you know, Rumi is from the 13th century, I believe.
Yeah.
And, you know, whenever I read Rumi, and I do pretty much every day these days, when you're reading him, well, Coleman Barks's amazing translations, you know, you feel this sort of thing that Gurdjieff was about, that he just didn't conform. And yet, at the same time, in order to get a following to follow him, he would have to make large amounts of money really quickly. And what happened in his later part of his life was that, for instance, he would go from Paris to some other place and he would take 30 people with him and board them all and feed them all and travel them all. And none of them had to pay anything.
That's pretty amazing right there.
Yeah, it's an astonishing thing that he just felt that he had to make the money so those people didn't do it. However, they did have to work. I'm going to keep getting back to his work, and I have a great thing here, which I want to read because it made me laugh so much. This is what he considered to be work. In the American Traveling Workshop, which was a phony thing, but he did mend everything. But he was a real rascal, you know, because if the person was rich and came in with an electric spark machine, which was one of the early ways in which they exhibited electric sparks between, poles. And they come and say, it doesn't work anymore. Dr. Gurdjieff, can you help me? And he'd say, it's going to take a long time. I'm only here for 6 weeks. And then the guy would go out of the shop and he mended in 12 seconds. Because he was brilliant at mending things. And then the guy would come in 2 weeks and say, "Is it done?" "No, it's taking a long time." And that cost you a lot more rubles. And in that way, instead of charging 10 rubles, he charged 300. And so that's how he made enough money to take these people. But what he made them do, it's typical of this, what they'd have to do in that context. People cleaned and prepared the metal things. Oh, please. No. No.
But
I'm doing a podcast. Okay. Okay. Challenging.
Great.
Okay, the elder cleaned and prepared the metal things for galvanizing and polished them afterwards. And the younger ran errands and kindled the fire in the forge and kept the bellows going. Towards the end, I was also helped, and by no means badly, by 6 young girls from local patriarchal families, whose parents, desiring them to have a complete education, sent them to my universal workshop to perfect themselves in fine needlework. Even at the beginning, when there were only 4 of us, the quantity of work done was indeed such that it gave the impression that behind the door leading to the back rooms, on which of course there was a notice, "Entrance strictly forbidden to the public," at least several dozen expert craftsmen were working. The workshop was open in Ashgabat 3.5 months, and during that time I'd made 50,000 rubles. Do you know what such a sum that is? And, it sounds sort of contradictory in a way, because, but as Maharaji said to Krishnamurti, "That's how I make my grub." And, and so these two sides of him are what attract me, because, there's no dichotomy between living on the planet, living in the material world, and his aspiration for transcendental realizations and teaching them. And his favorite place was America, strangely enough. He didn't spend too much time in England. He would go from Fontainebleau in Paris to New York, where I live, and he said it was easy. People would flock in. He never had a problem. The people just loved it. And he said it was because America was a place where people were so completely, he didn't say this, I'm saying, but summing up, he said they were ready for something like this. Whereas if you went to Frankfurt or Strasbourg,
so
or they were just, "What are you talking about? Get out of here."
apparently his last words were, "America is great," or some crazy thing, right?
You found it. I didn't find that. He said
maybe
that.
it's, of course, whether it's true or not, it's something.
No, I
else.
think it could be true, because he really did believe in the America of the early 20s, when Woodrow Wilson sort of, created the League of Nations and helped stop the First World War. Of course, he then went on to see the rise of fascism in Europe in the 30s and lived all the way through that. And I have no idea what Gurdjieff's response was to that. He certainly wasn't in Germany. And it certainly had nothing to do with the war, because war was an abomination to him, as it is to me and everyone. So, I think that, when we had our little chat about this, I said, well, I'm not sure I want to do this, because it's so difficult to read. It's so difficult to read. It really is. And,
well, that's why we have a podcast now. You don't have to read, just listen to the podcast.
You actually don't. Well, if and this is one of those things that, I almost hate to say, but it sometimes happens. The Wikipedia entry about Gurdjieff is just fantastic.
Oh.
It's long. It was obviously written by someone who was in that institute, or someone who is a Gurdjieff follower to this day, because it's absolutely full of great stuff and tells you everything about what he did and who he was. So I recommend Wikipedia to you. I also recommend
put it in the show notes. We'll put a link there.
Yeah.
Figure it out. Yeah.
It's easier than reading, what I did myself, because Meetings with Remarkable Men is really meetings with himself. Because every single remarkable man, and they were mainly men, but there were a few women, he would get from them what they had to offer, but he wouldn't stay with them, and he wouldn't necessarily like them, but he found them to be utterly fascinating in the sense that they were independent of that psychosis called Western politics and government. He had no great love for any authoritarianism or governments telling you what to do and so on. He was very firm about that. But he was aware that if people were ever going to change, they would have to open their hearts and stop following fools. Because he was, of all the people I've ever read about or known about, he was the most, he could not suffer fools at all because he considered it a waste of time for the other people in the room and for himself. And the only way he would ever suffer them would be if he could make some money from them. I mean, if anybody's listening from...
That's a great thing.
Well, it's true. If anybody's listening from the Gurdjieff Institute or whatever, I'm sorry if I'm being old, but this is what I've learned, and I started learning it when I was 16, so it's, 100 years ago.
After going through some of this, I remembered one thing that was an important aspect of being able to embody a perspective that allowed one to move forward in their life. And it was called self-remembering. That is an actual practice. He said, in spite of all my desires and endeavors, I could not succeed in remembering myself, even sufficiently to hinder the associations flowing in me. So he established the importance of self-remembering, but he had limited success in achieving it. And then a new idea occurs to him. This is the best of all. He realized that in order to remember himself, okay, and what are we talking about? We're talking about mindfulness, right? Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, really, Ram Dass, that's what he got out of them and incorporated into his work, which was witness, right? Self-remembering, witness. And then, we move on to the end of his life, which was just you can't do anything like that because you're still in the judging mind space, but go into your heart space, and it's loving awareness. And so he had a whole arc, but it's certainly part of it was Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. So, okay, in order to remember himself always and everywhere, he must create an alarm clock that will remind him always and everywhere. And he realizes that such an alarm clock can only be created through sacrifice. Isn't that far? If he sacrificed a deep element in his psychology so that its absence would be constantly felt, it could serve as a permanent reminder. I mean, this is really...
Well,
unique thought, unique thinking, right? This person.
But, I'm very glad you brought up Ram Dass, because Ram Dass had a more kind of friendly way of putting it. But Gurdjieff was similar in that respect, that he would self-remember and then remember he wasn't remembering what he already learned and would get down on himself in order to grasp it again. Because it wasn't that he'd forget it and never do it again. It was just that he knew that his mind was a furnace and it would burn things immediately after thinking of them. And then he would have to find it again. And the way he found it was by meeting remarkable men and women, but also by encountering his own propensity for self-dislike.
Or called the Kaleshas. The Kaleshas, those things in our lives which are basically demonic. We are attracted to them in such a negative way that we find it very difficult to transform. Those are the Buddhists call the Kaleshas.
I didn't
Actually,
know
in
that
the
word.
Hindus. Yeah.
It's like dukkha. In other words, sort of like the Buddhist dukkha, state of dukkha. That you're stuck in stuff that doesn't help yourself or anyone. Maybe Gurdjieff is still alive in a way because of that. That it really is an echo of, in a different time and in a different way, of what Ram Dass personified. Not only him, but he did it. He was so incredibly articulate that he could, I remember so many times not being near him, but going to lectures or whatever, just being in an audience and watching him. And how many times during that lecture, something would just click in the consciousness, and you go, oh, I'm like that. I really am like that. I do that all the time. I've got to, what can I do? And then he'd get to that, what you can do. And, you know, in the Love Serve Remember words of wisdom that I get, sometimes I read them and I just think, God, why haven't I thought of that before? I've not had that exact take on it. It's not that you haven't really thought round it, but Ramdas's take on it was always so delightfully precise and sometimes funny, sometimes sad, you know, whatever. Gurdjieff was much more dour. I never know how to describe that.
Yeah,
dour. You know, I mean, he was just a guy that really, you know, when he talks about his wife dying young of cancer, he was obviously incredibly melancholy about that, but he used it to sort of see that in a somewhat Buddhist way, that suffering is a teacher. As much as we don't want it, ever, it is happening to every single human being that ever lived. So and I think someone said once that 10 billion people have lived on this planet so far, or more maybe, but like that. And out of all of those people, in his opinion, in Gurdjieff's opinion, only that tiny percentage gets to that point. And there, you know, you can get into such stuff about reincarnation, how long it takes to pass the tests. But when you start thinking like that, it can be quite depressing. Whereas Gurdjieff was not depressing, even though he was dark sometimes and angry sometimes. He was not depressing because it was always about, how does this crowd of people in front of me that are listening to me, how do they come to an awareness that I already have? And then how can I move on from that awareness and not become stuck in that?
Did he speak English? So when he came to speak in America?
I do not think he spoke good English, no. I don't think he did.
So there was a translator?
No, he would speak. His languages were Armenian, Russian, Greek, and Turkish. He spoke all of those fluently. And you know, most people thought that he was a Greek by the way he looked. But he was just a mix of, as we all are. But, you know, his mother, as I said, was Armenian. His father was Greek. And, you know, I never thought he was Greek. That didn't occur to me. I always thought Gurdjieff sounds like a Russian name. And it obviously is not. It's Ivanovich Gurdjieff. Isn't that Russian? If anybody knows it. It does. But in fact, he only grew. It's like, you know, someone who's growing up in the 60s or 50s in Lithuania or Estonia or Poland or Hungary or Yugoslavia, all those places they enslaved after the, you know, in Soviet times. That's what he was above, because he would travel everywhere that was important to him and be able to speak in that language. Also, he disguised himself all the time. He wore disguises all the time because he would go into areas where tribal wars were going on, and if you didn't look like them, they would instantly kill you. And he loved this, by the way. Totally crazy.
I mean, talk about a remarkable man. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
under any circumstance. But the fact that it got into our lexicon,
yes,
you know, as we were growing up into the path, it is remarkable. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, for me, the reason I even mentioned it to you when I did was because I was actually thinking about what were the precursors to the way I live now, or most of the people I love do. And I had to say that the first thing that ever happened to me on that level was Gurdjieff.
Yeah.
And because of my father's insistence, because he could see I was, you know, a really sort of naughty adolescent, basically. and that I liked, well, you know, not bad, not vicious, not angry, but, you know, I lived in a way that I don't think he totally approved of.
Yeah.
And, you know, like one night I maybe I should stop right there.
No, you can't do that.
No, I had a girlfriend when I was 16, Yvonne, and she was my first real girlfriend. I won't go further than that, but to say that she was my first real girlfriend because of we loved each other, and you know, we had that kind of relationship. And I was with her for a year, and then someone else told me that she was actually the fiance of a soldier
No.
an English soldier who was stationed in Germany, and she kind of left him for me. So one night I was in a pub called The Ship. I remember this like it was yesterday. And I was with her. And then a friend of mine, Jess Cox, said, my brother is here. I said, really? Who's your brother? He said, well, he's in his uniform, actually. No. And he's at the back of the pub in the alley, and he wants to talk to you.
Oh,
So I went out the back, and he didn't talk to me. He just punched me right in the face. And I fell on the ground. And then two of my mates, Rob and John, came out of the pub, and then there was just a fist fight, a big one, in an alleyway. And then the cops came, and then the cops took me home, and my father was completely freaked out by this. I mean, he just looked at me and thought, you are just a fucking loser. I mean, basically, he was very angry with me. So the Gurdjieff thing came very soon after that. In other words, he wanted to say to me, you know, that's all very well.
There's another way.
You know, first of all, you can never win a fight to win your life. I mean, you're the worst fighter on earth, which is true. And then, you know, secondly, you're fighting with a soldier, because cops told him the whole thing. They arrested the soldier too, by the way. They didn't arrest us. They just took us all to our houses. That's Britain in 1960.
Yeah.
And of course, they weren't armed ever. And there were, when in England at that time, there were 30 murders a year in the entire British Isles. If they got to 50, there would be a parliamentary debate about it. Oh, now there are 50 every day here, but let's not digress. But my father did see that this particular kind of path was possibly something I could understand. Fact is, I didn't. But I'd never forget his face when he was saying this to me. He was like saying, "Don't be a misbehavior. Don't do that. It's not you. And why are you doing that?" And I didn't explain to him that I was going out with someone who was someone else's fiance. You know, I didn't bring that up. So he didn't know. But he wanted to straighten me out. You know, he just wanted, and he used Gurdjieff and Uspensky and Raj and Bennett to do that.
Oh, amazing. You know, and here you are.
Apparently.
You're completely straightened out.
Unlike you. No, I haven't.
Really unlike me.
No, no, but I mean, you know, you've said, and others have said too, that some of the greatest teachers we've had and gurus and masters and so on could be rascals. And that not to the extent that Gurdjieff, because he was essentially not a Westerner, not an Easterner. He was someone who was fascinated by the East and felt that the West had lost its way. And said the only wisdom is in the past, so we got to find that. We got to dig deep into our psyche to find the wisdom of Tibet and India. And India was very important to him. Oh, and by the way, when just before I left my dad's study, he said, "Come back. There are photographs in the middle of this book, and I want you to look and study at them all." And I opened them, and they were yogis and fakirs from northern India. And that was my first encounter with any of that. And they were doing all kinds of strange things. But my dad said to me, "Look, these are humans like you. I'm not saying you should do this, but just look at those pictures, man." And I was, whoa, man, guys with legs twisted behind their head. And I thought my dad had gone crazy, actually. And my mother definitely thought he'd gone crazy. But the truth of it is, and I say this with great reverence, he was not scared of death. And he was incredibly, he was a God person. A real one. And he didn't have any interest in any religions whatsoever. Never entered a synagogue or a church. Never. He just read and thought. And that was a great sort of inspiration for me, really.
It's wonderful. Well, everybody, there you have it. Just to ask the experts.
Did we finish here?
An hour just went by like nothing. And we'll put a bunch of this stuff in the show notes. And I must say, we must include, we could put De Hartman in too. You know, I'm just remembering that.
Well, how do we
dance
do that?
thing that was the people who, like, they're going to listen to this whole thing and they're going to create link. Unless you want to send a couple of links, that wouldn't be
Well, I'd be happy to do that because, you know, he didn't write that much. I mean, he wrote huge books.
No,
and
but I mean
destroyed-
to include Ouspensky particularly.
Ouspensky,
has to
dead
be.
right. Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely.
Yes.
And Raj and J.G. Bennett. Because I got into reading Bennett, apart from all the others, because he was English and he wrote beautifully.
Wonder if we could find something on the Sermon thing. That is really wild.
I'd never heard of it until I read it in the Meetings of Remarkable Men book.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but he believed that they were still not in the 7th century. He felt he was a seeker, and the word has sort of gone out of fashion now because people tend to say, and I think correctly, I'm not a seeker. I'm a finder. The seeking is, I mean, it's just a word, but it means that you're constantly looking. He was always looking to his very last thing. He just always was aware that there was a better place to go in consciousness-wise, and the transformation was far more important than, shall we say, normal behavior. That you go and force yourself to expand and grow and deepen.
Yeah. Like I say, we're going to put as much as we can. David will send over some links as well, and we'll put them in the show notes. And you just go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/mindrolling. And while you're on the network, there's lots of other incredible podcasts.
Oh, man.
You know that Sharon Salzberg she has been for the last quite a while. She's talking to other people. She's not, in other words, we're not just taking a Dharma talk and converting it into a podcast. She's actually, and so many wonderful people are coming to light by virtue of her podcast, and I hope the same for what we do. So I thank you for being here, Dave.
My great pleasure.
You see Maya?
Thank you.
Maya, she's sitting on the chair.
Oh, look at her.
She's my podcast partner since you have been here.
I mean, I had mine, and she's gone. That's a whole. I mean, Gurdjieff would have a lot to. He would have a lot to say about what it means to lose a precious animal after 12 years of unconditional love. I'm still suffering. It's only 6 weeks, and I can't get away from it, but I'll do my best,
Yeah.
Okay, well, great.
Thanks for being here, and we're going to see you folks next week. Have a great week, and we'll see you later.
Thanks, Raghu.